Hello, everyone, and welcome to this new Podcast Hamzoon. It's been a while since we've made any podcast like this one, but that's okay because today we are making a one. What is the benefit of the podcast? Is it necessary for everyone to hear this podcast or not? Is it going to be in English or is it going to be in Arabic? That's a good question. In the podcast, there are many important ideas that should be explained and that should be written. As we know, Podcast Hamzoon has been going for about a year, and there has been many constructive ideas about this podcast. What is the main construction of this podcast? And is it going to be one of the most important podcasts of the century, or is it only going to be a podcast to discuss different ideas and different basics? I wish that you all understand this podcast and relate to it. Because after all, what is the podcast? And is it necessary for someone to make a podcast? And is it something of utmost importance to make one or not? First of all, to make a podcast is better than not making a podcast. And even better than to watch a YouTube video or a Facebook video. And that's why the podcast is important. It gives that who makes it a relaxation temper and time to think. Especially when it comes to the English language, as this language needs a lot of contribution and constructive thoughts for it to properly establish itself in a realm of majestic environment. And that's why this podcast has been made. Therefore, everyone in the world has the ability to make a podcast and should do so. Because not making a podcast means for the developed world and for the human being in this century is not to be able to communicate the ideas and thoughts. And that is why the podcast is important. And that's why the podcast needs to be done unnecessary. Of course, thank you for listening to this podcast all the time. We will make some podcasts such as this one today and tomorrow if we get a chance, and even after a week or a year. So what is the podcast about? Today's podcast is about the English language and how important it is to communicate this language with other people rather than only hearing it online, because the World Wide Web is filled with information and knowledge about English that is being relayed to the listener. But unfortunately, there are no other opposite way so that the listener direct his ideas and thoughts at the opposite way to the World Wide Web. And by that I mean it's really difficult to make a YouTube video or a music video that attracts different kind of personalities, and even those people that will be attracted, they won't have the ability to directly communicate with the video maker or the podcast podcaster? Well, there is one thing to add in this podcast. And this podcast will give you some kind of a knowledge about what people should do in their spare time. Some people do have full-time jobs. Actually, that's most people in this time. I think so. Unless they have enough money to sustain their living expenses for at least 50 years to come. Otherwise, they will still have to get a full-time job. And getting a full-time job, whether it was easy or hard or mediocre, will drain the human's ability to communicate and to make great videos. And that's why the podcast comes in handy and in benefit for the podcast maker. As for this podcast maker, he would find it difficult to make an established and relatable video. And even when he makes a podcast, that podcast will be empty and out of context most of the time. Only by using his mouth, if he has the energy or she to relay their problems and communicate their ideas, then the podcast would be successful. And the fortunate thing is that people from all around the world, they can hear it. So if someone here and there hear the podcast, he can respond and make a podcast response for the podcast that he already heard. And that would have no discrepancy between those two podcasts, as the first one has the same ability and the same value of the other responding podcast. And that's why the podcast is important. That's why the podcast has to be done every day and every year, at least once. The podcast is an easy way for people to communicate, and it is a way for individuals to relate their ideas and problems they are facing in real life. If people only makes videos online, then it would be entertaining, that's right. But I don't think the YouTube as atmosphere will sustain such a consistent amount of videos. And that's why the podcast comes handy for people to make less effort making podcast or a video, and for their ideas to communicate easily, as to make a video that would require a lot of energy. And even if someone makes about 10 videos, would they be at the level of others to watch it and give it a like and watch ads, then go buy those ads for the YouTube to be sustainable environment? I don't think so. But instead, as it began, it was a tube that communicate ideas and knowledge between different peoples. And it will probably still in a different way and mean this time. As we can see, the atmosphere of YouTube is getting worse and worse each year, and there are fewer and fewer videos that are necessary and easy to digest. And as we can also see, the big corporations and the big companies are succeeding in that aspect, unlike the individuals. For that idea to be expressed and communicated, there has to be something called a podcast. And that's why the podcast is a necessary mean and a communicating method for people to enjoy, at least for about 10 to 20 years to come, as people need time to rest their ideas as a community and a collective members of the big online society. It is really hard to find people all around the world giving responses to the podcasts. And it's even harder to find podcasts that are genuine and coming from individuals that are fighting the fight and having to deal with the real life problems. For those to be existing is a few economical status and social value. That's why their ideas and knowledge would be suppressed, only communicating through a verbal method. But at this day and age, it is easier to communicate ideas through an online community. As we all can see, at the next election or the previous one, there would be a lot of misinformation and miscommunication going around the atmosphere and the air. And that's why the podcasts come in handy, as for large groups, even for ground news or news websites and channels, their ways of communication would be difficult to communicate, especially at this stage. And that's why the podcast becomes important and a very big method to communicate. It is important and crucial to say that this podcast coming from Mr. Yusuf, he is a dentist working at a special center, and I am merely a part or a dot, or what can I say, a part of a series in this universe. And that big chain, or I don't know what's the proper word, as I am not a native speaker, so we can't say it's a part of a chain. I don't know what to call that in a simple vocabulary world, but I guess it is to say I have to think about it for a minute. Let me Google Translate, though I am not usually used to doing that while I am making a podcast, but I will just for the sake of this world. Give me a second. I guess it is called link. So when you go to a chain of an iron chain, let's say for an example, you get that iron chain holding its one part on one hand and the other from the other hand. Between that chain, there are different links that linking this chain. And I guess the proper English word for that is link. There are probably another word that that I have not found in Google Translate, but it should be existing. In Arabic we call halaqa or halaqa. Yes, we call halaqa. But in English there are nothing but link of a chain. So it is only me, a link in a chain of life. For me to begin at this stage, hoping and what do they say? Willing or aspiring or keying or actually dreaming of becoming some part of a bigger picture. But unfortunately, starting at this country and starting at this age, it is really and nearly impossible to do anything. Still, I will try to be a good link in this part of the universe. To be a link, and there has been many people that have been a link, that have they built something that others built upon, is some idealistic and opportunistic and altruistic stand and altruistic position. So they did take. And not only to be an altruistic link is to provide others with language and for me with hope and to improve my English in this podcast. That's not only the thing that this podcast is aspiring to make. But also to make a podcast something that people can communicate between each other easily. I know they would have a lot of time to listen, but hopefully artificial intelligence will be a good way for people, even in my position and weak link, to develop as quickly as possible. Otherwise, I will be only a simple link in this world as others, trying to be a better link and a stronger one for others to hold on to. So that was the analogy of the link and the idealistic idea of podcast making. And I am fortunate enough to make a podcast talking about different philosophical and idealistic ideas in this world. Although I hoped that I can become even better contributor by engaging in a program of master degree or a bachelor degree in a country that, let's say, developed and already prosperous. But hey, what are you talking about as the starting point of this persona? We can say it is still at a primitive level. That's why it would only be a link, and it would make individuals other than itself more prosperous and hoping for the best. In that position or geographical location or in others. One thing to talk about in this podcast of my position in this life, maybe it would be nice to talk even though no one hear or listen. Therefore, I would say there will be an IELTS test the next 2 weeks that I will take, and it's nice to have an open diary for individuals in a podcast, although it would be hard for them to hear it fully, as each one has his time well spent doing chores or taking rests. I hope my English has been improved after talking to you in an English language, so that my IELTS score will get at least 6.5 degrees in speaking. But we'll see about that, and I hope you have understood everything that I said so far. It is a rat race after all, and I understand and realize that my position in this life nothing but a rat trying to race its way out of the box to find itself in another one. But I will always try to do that, because I know the outer box will be a little less dangerous and a little less I wanted to say the word gloomy, or a little less, it was gloofy from the other world or the box. And I hope you have understood the analogy that I have already said to you. I'm sorry that I have a different way and a different accent to relate my ideas. They would take you few episodes to understand what I'm talking about. That's why I have put it in a Precast Hamzoon. This podcast is, I think it would be only focusing on an English language, not French, as I know my French language is as bad as it could be. And I might talk in an Egyptian accent in a few times, but after all, my Egyptian has nothing to do with what I'm willing to be in life. Instead, I'm willing to be a good English speaker, and I know it's difficult, as my work does not demand any English language to be applied and implicated with it. Thank you for hearing this podcast. And one more note that I want to add is, if someone feeling that he needs to talk about something in life that's important and willing to talk with other people, then there is a Discord English learning channels that has nice communities to talk to. But of course, making a podcast is the ultimate goal of this session, as talking to a video or a YouTube space is something that provides me with enough time and knowledge, perfecting my way of speaking and pronunciation to be better without any interruption. Thank you for listening to this podcast, and goodbye.